One of the most important voices for me throughout this has been Professor Omer Bartov, who is the Samuel Pisar Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University. I interviewed Professor Bartov many months ago. So much has happened, and I'm afraid to say, when we say so much has happened, what we're talking about is a colossal amount of human suffering. Tens of thousands have been killed, injured, vast amounts of trauma, unspeakable trauma on a daily basis as we speak. Now, he's written a brilliant piece for the Guardian newspaper, which was entitled, "As a former IDF soldier and historian of genocide, I was deeply disturbed by my recent visit to Israel." And I've been thinking about this piece since I read it, which was last week, so it's published just over a week ago. A huge amount of moral clarity, of humanity, scholarly, evolution of thought, questioning. So we're going to talk about that and much else. But firstly, it's great to see you as ever. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I just want to start just actually by this. You talk basically in large part about an evolution of your own thinking that you'd written in the New York Times last November, that as a historian of genocide, I believe there's no proof that genocide is now taking place in Gaza, though it's very likely, you say, war crimes and even crimes against humanity are happening. And then you warn, you say from history, it's important to warn of the potential for genocide rather than belatedly condemn it after it has taken place. But this, following a visit to Israel, and it should be noted, I should make it clear, of course, you're an Israeli American, you've been convinced that it's no longer possible to deny Israel's engaged in systematic war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocidal ideations. And I think the key central point here is where you write, "It is also clearly indicated the ultimate goal of this entire undertaking from the very beginning had been to make the entire Gaza Strip uninhabitable and debilitate its population to such a degree that it would either die out or seek all possible options to flee the territory." That brought to mind to me Giora Ireland, an Israeli general who wrote a piece for Fathom, which is a journal I should say is affiliated to BICOM, the main pro-Israel lobbying organization in Britain, which was cited in South Africa's case alleging genocide, in which he set that out as a strategy: stay and starve, or and die, or leave. And he's an advisor to Yoav Gallant, the defense minister. Is that, I mean, do you think basically that now that's been the strategy from day one, that the starting point is the entire population, we don't want them there, and how we get from them being there to not being there, that's where, you know, the questions emerge? What do you think?
Well, you know, I mean, this is really the question, and I'm not sure we'll ever know for certain what the plans were, and if there were any clear plans at the beginning. My own sense is that, judging by the general incompetence of army planning for this operation and the various voices that were raised, I think that there were pressures in one way or another. I think there were people, meaning I don't think that there was a clear plan from the beginning that everybody agreed on, but rather that there were various pressures, including, of course, the ideas by Giora Ireland. The general idea, I think, was a combination of the goals that they had declared at the beginning, that they wanted to destroy Hamas and to free the hostages, and that they wanted revenge, and they wanted to flatten as much as Gaza as they could. This is, I think, the general outline that they had, but the operations, as they started rolling them out, and I think we talked about it last time, there was a certain tactics that the IDF had used already in 2014, and that was scaled up to the whole of Gaza rather than to this more limited operation of 2014. And that means that in the areas in which you operate, you first of all destroy them. You destroy them by aerial bombardment, by shelling, by tank fire, by bulldozers, and then you move in the infantry. So if you scale that up to saying, I'm going to destroy Hamas entirely, then you are assuming already that you're going to destroy much of the area. Now, as they were failing to do that, and as Hamas continued to fight, I think increasingly those who were talking about taking over the whole thing got the upper hand, because had the army been more effective, if had it been able to, and I'm not sure it was, but had it been more effective in accomplishing its goals, maybe there would have been fewer pressures. But since this was not going well, and very slowly, I think those pressures built up. And you can see that in the kind of policies that are being carried out right now. So a few weeks ago, there was a report that the whole northern third of Gaza, and this was a very detailed report with aerial photography and so forth, that whole area has been flattened. Now, there seem to be about 300,000 people there. So most of the people have been kicked out. And most of the buildings have been destroyed: universities, houses, schools. A new road has been paved, and army camps have been built there, Israeli army camps. Now, whether this was the plan at the beginning, I'm not sure. But as it is rolling out, this appears to be the case. So if you try to connect this to the notion of is it a premeditated genocidal plan or not, my own sense is that the whole thing was not premeditated, but that it has become that. And so in that sense, my evolving thinking has to do also with the evolving policy on the ground, and that by now, conditions are such that if you look back at what has happened, you can see that over time, this is what the IDF has accomplished. And at some point, and I don't know that we'll ever know at which point, this became by and large the strategy. Now, can it work? And I'm not sure, but it depends very much on outside pressures, as well as to some extent on internal Israeli politics. But internal Israeli politics right now is at a stalemate, and Netanyahu has probably more power now than he did several months ago.
What you wrote actually brought to mind what the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor wrote in his application for arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant for crimes against humanity and war crimes, in which he set out in detail, well, he partly explained what the war crimes and crimes of humanity alleged were in service of. One of them was to collectively punish the civilian population of Gaza, whom they perceived as a threat to Israel. And I mean, if I go back to what, on the 9th of October, 2023, Major General Ghassan Alian said, Israeli army coordinator government activities in the territories, he said that Hamas became ISIS and the citizens of Gaza are celebrating instead of being horrified. Human animals are dealt with accordingly. Israel has imposed a total blockade in Gaza. No electricity, no water, just damage. You wanted hell, you'll get hell. Clearly, no demarcation there. He means the entire civilian population. That's what he's talking about. Do you think that's what, you know, I mean, could you say whether or not there's a blueprint or not? I mean, and you know, lots of genocides throughout history clearly didn't have blueprints at all at the beginning. That's, I mean, we'll talk about that. But it was that this idea that the population, the civilian population collectively is held actually to be a threat, that you can't demarcate the enemy, military enemy, and the civilian population. And that's where Israel starts with and then works backwards.
Yeah, so first of all, there were many statements, not only by Ghassan Alian, but many others, of course, at the beginning, that we should wipe them out, that there are no uninvolved people, that everybody and is involved somehow. You add to that the sort of rationale that the IDF is trying to sell, that, well, they're using the civilian population as human shields. Of course, if you operate in Gaza, there is no other way but to operate from within populated areas, because it's a very small area, very densely populated. So anywhere you operate, there are civilians there. And so if you connect the statements that were being made at the time and the policies that have gradually rolled out, you see a logic there. Whether that logic was there at the beginning or not, as I said before, as a plan, that's not entirely clear. The ICC, the prosecutor, was a bit wary of saying that too, and he really focused more on policies of deprivation of food, of hunger, because it was easier to prove that, right? Now, generally speaking, I think you're totally right. That is, generally speaking, the problem, as it is seen by Israeli policy makers and the military, is that Gaza is an area that is full of densely populated by Palestinians, mostly by refugees, and that it is from that mass of population that, as Israeli policy makers see it, violence emanates toward Israel. And how do you solve that issue? Now, obviously, there are two ways, generally speaking, of doing that. One is political. That is, you have to find some way of living side by side. The other is military. And if it's military, the military has not been able to resolve that. And this is not something that started this year or last year or in 2014. This goes back, as I write in this piece, at least to 1956. That is that most of the Palestinians living in Gaza, mostly descendants of Palestinians who had lived very close to Gaza in towns and villages in southern Israel, what is now southern Israel, northern Negev, southern Israel. And so if you don't find a political solution to this, you have to find a military solution to this. And that military solution can be either to fence them in, which is what Israel has been trying to do. And all this attempt by Netanyahu for years to bribe Hamas, in a sense, to have money go to Hamas from Qatar, so that Hamas could run the business in Gaza. And he could say that he cannot negotiate with Hamas because they are so radical. And of course, he can't negotiate with the people in the West Bank because they're so ineffective. And therefore, we can just manage things. That kind of policy failed on October 7th. And so if you can't manage it and you don't want to politically resolve it, what is left? What is left is some kind of destruction. You have to flatten it. You have to debilitate the population. And if you can, you have to push it out. So the logic of this it has always been there. And it's based on the on Israeli decision, which is not only by people like Netanyahu. He goes way back. He goes to people like Dayan, Moshe Dayan in the 1950s. We cannot reverse things. We took over their land, and they know it, and they will keep fighting us. And then the question is, do we have a political solution to this or a military one? And from the 1950s, the answer is a military one. And that's how you get to where you are now. There are moments where there were attempts to handle this differently, including Moshe Dayan himself, of course, at some point in his life. And then under Rabin, during the 1990s, the first half of the 1990s. But if those go away, then what's left is the military. And you have to use the military against the civilian population because Hamas is an expression. It's a very radical expression, but it is an expression of a will by a population to resist. One can say clearly Hamas is not very popular in Gaza right now. But whatever happens, if the population stays there and if Hamas goes away, then something else will appear there. The issue will not go away. As long as there is no political solution to it.
So just be clear about your position now. I mean, as you wrote in the piece, you spoke about the rhetoric spouted by Israeli leaders since 7th October now being translated into reality. So the point was that that rhetoric was genocide, but that didn't mean genocide was inevitable, that was a possibility, and you were warning against it. But you said now that's been translated into reality, namely, as the 1948 UN Genocide Convention puts it, that Israel was acting with intent to destroy in whole or in part the Palestinian people in Gaza, such as by killing, causing serious harm, or inflicting conditions of life meant to bring about the group's destruction. So just to be clear, is that where we're at? This is a genocide which is ongoing as we speak. Is that your clear position?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can't, as I read that, I mean, I've tried to be as careful as I can, or as I could, to not jump to conclusions. I think by now we can say that there was genocidal rhetoric at the beginning, and now there are actions on the ground. And I dated my own evolving thinking to May 8th, because on May 8th, the IDF moved into Rafah, and it was asked not to do so by the Americans. And they did so anyway, and they triumphantly said that the Americans had told them that they can't move in because there's so many civilians there. And they said, no, 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 we can move the civilians. And they triumphantly said, yes, we did. We succeeded in moving them. And indeed, they moved 800,000 people, so moved them. I mean, they evicted them from Rafah, and they moved them to the coastal area. Now, for many of these civilians, this was the second or third or fourth time that they'd been displaced. And they were moved into an area that has no infrastructure. And so the population now has been shuttled around again and again and again. The humanitarian conditions there are absolutely appalling. There's now more and more, just the other day, they identified polio there. IDF troops have been inoculated for polio, but what about the population there? And so what appears to be the case is that the population is being gradually debilitated. That is, it is being brought to a situation where its own life, its own existence is being made impossible. These are conditions that assure the weakening, massive death of the population, which will then lead it either to die out there in large numbers or to flee. And that's what the UN resolution on Convention on Genocide calls genocide. Now, the one thing that remains, and that's why I sort of spoke about genocidal actions. Now, admittedly, it's a bit of a cop-out to say genocidal actions, because what are genocidal actions? They're actions of genocide. Yeah. But the one thing that remains and may never be clear, and the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, may also leave it open, is whether there was a premeditated plan to do that, or whether this was an evolving kind of operation that ended up carrying out these genocidal actions. I have to say that historically, that's what happens in most genocides, including in the Holocaust. There was no, in 1939, there was no premeditated plan to kill all the Jews of Europe. It was an evolving policy, incremental.
1941, wasn't it? Yeah, the Wannsee Conference.
Yes, but even that, I mean, you probably don't want to get into that, yes, but the Wannsee Conference is also problematic because the killing actually begins before, and what the Wannsee Conference says would be the policy is actually not the policy that is eventually carried out. So, you know, it's more about coordinating state agencies than rolling out a particular clear plan. So genocides are usually like that. But if you can show that there was an intention at some point, and that is what is expressed in the Wannsee Conference, yes, to kill 11 million Jews in Europe. That is stated clearly in Wannsee. If you can show that there is an intention at the beginning, at some point, maybe October 8th, maybe 2 months later, we just have to kick them out, or we have to take over the whole territory and make life impossible for them, then it would be easier to say, yes, this is strictly speaking genocide. If not, and I suspect that it'll be probably, it's unlikely that this will be found, in part because I think it's unlikely that such orders actually went out, that there's anything in writing like that. Then we will be able to say this was a genocidal operation which led or attempted to create a situation where Palestinians would either leave or be completely debilitated. And this is what has happened up to now. Reports are absolutely devastating. And it's not clear to me, even if all of this were to stop right now, what will happen to the population? It'll take decades to recover. The long-term effects are enormous. And as you saw in the Lancet report, the expected death rate is much, much higher than the 40,000 that we're talking about now.
Because we know from precedents that the vast majority of people actually end up dying because of indirect causes rather than violence. I mean, just on that, in terms of, you say, in terms of things being written down, it's striking that last month it was reported in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz that Benjamin Netanyahu ordered the Israeli army to turn off recordings of meetings, that it was normally an automatic operation. But immediately after 7th of October, he ordered the recordings to be turned off and the army complied with that order.
Yeah, look, I mean, Netanyahu, again, he's partly it's so that we don't have a record of operations, but partly it's Netanyahu's own paranoia, because Netanyahu basically would like to erase the record of all his major errors, or what led to the fiasco of October 7th and the fiasco that has been happening ever since. We have to say that while on the one hand, and that's the most important issue, of course, Israel has been conducting a war of destruction in Gaza, the situation of his own citizens, of the people that he is supposed to care for, that is, of Israeli citizens, has greatly deteriorated since October 7th. There are tens of thousands of displaced people, that thousands and thousands of reservists being called up again and again, and then when they come home, they have no jobs, they have no businesses, the state is not supporting them. People are now being forced, people being displaced are now being forced by the government to go back to their homes, which have been destroyed and are unsafe because the government doesn't want to pay for it anymore. And that's quite apart from, of course, talking about what's happening in the north. So Netanyahu doesn't want to have any record of anything because his government is both incompetent and has a particular interest. And its interest is not the interest of most of the citizens of the state. Its interest is both gradual ethnic cleansing in the West Bank and the destruction of Gaza, and to the extent that it's possible, and it looks like he's succeeding in that, to perpetuate Netanyahu in power for the foreseeable future.
Just on, because we started talking there just about the historical context, and this is what I wanted to, one of the things I wanted to talk to you as one of the world's preeminent experts on genocide, of course, which is, I mean, do you think that cheerleaders for this horror have benefited somewhat from a kind of widespread ignorance about genocide and its history, in that the Holocaust is often people's main reference point? But, and I'm putting this to you as questions, the Holocaust is an outlier in many ways. That was the industrialized, systematic extermination of the Jewish people in a very short period of time, the attempt across borders to seek out every last Jewish person and murder them. Whereas, and you know, if we look at other genocides, take Rwanda, there you had an armed conflict where, for example, if you were going to be, I mean, this would be a completely misleading historical narrative, but you could say, well, this all began in 1990 when the Tutsi rebel army, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, invaded from Uganda and committed many terrible war crimes when they did. They killed hundreds of civilians accused of rape, and actually went on to kill huge numbers of Hutu civilians. And it was said by Hutu extremists that they're going to commit genocide against us. It was posed as an existential threat, which is, we either kill them or they're going to kill us. And, you know, with the Nazis, that had to be invented. I mean, it was the idea that the Bolsheviks are all Jewish. It's a Jewish conspiracy, and they're going to kill us. They're going to destroy Western civilization. But do you think that's kind of what people don't often understand, that genocides often arise where you have conflicts, where you actually have atrocities not just perpetrated on one side, and those other atrocities are then used to justify genocidal onslaught, because that is what happened in Rwanda.
Well, look, I mean, there are two issues here. The one that you mentioned obviously is correct, and many people have pointed out, that is that when people talk about genocide and when they talk about international law as it was created after World War II and the Genocide Convention, there's a predilection to compare whatever happens to the Holocaust. And if it's not, so to speak, as bad as the Holocaust, not as systematic, not the numbers are not as high, then you say, well, it's not exactly genocide. Maybe it's something not as big. And that's, of course, an error. And if you look at the Genocide Convention itself, that's not at all what it says. But there is a tendency to grasp a genocide as a term because it describes such, it evokes such extreme evil. And that's used by everyone. So, you know, in Israel after October 7th, the argument was that Hamas tried to carry out genocide against Israel, and that this was just like the Holocaust. And people who opposed Israeli policies from the very beginning, it has to be admitted, said, oh, this is genocide of the Palestinians. And so people just go directly to that term because then you don't have to explain anything anymore. So that's true. And that's a problem with the term, and many people have pointed it out. I still think it is an important term, but I try to use it as carefully as possible, and I think people should. And the second question is different, I would say. The second question is, how do we, when we talk about genocide, how do people explain to themselves what they're doing? And I would say that in all genocides, including the Holocaust, including Rwanda, including the genocide of the Herero in 1904, the genocide of the Armenians in 1915, Kampuchea in 1975, in all those cases, the people carrying out the killing see themselves as victims. They see themselves as victims of the people they are killing. And they also imagine that if they don't kill those people, and especially because of the manner in which they're killing them, then those people who are now their victims will turn around and victimize them and do to them what is being done on them. And so in that sense, genocide is often a cycle of perception or reality, and it's not necessarily different of victimization. The second thing is that in all genocides that I can think of in the 20th century and in the 21st century now, there is either a reality or a semblance of war. That this is created under warlike conditions. And again, you can go through all the genocides that I mentioned. The Germans come in 1904 to German Southwest Africa, now Namibia, with an army. They're going to quell an uprising. It's a war. And they issue a Vernichtungsbefehl, an extermination order, right? This General von Trotta, the German general. The Ottomans in 1915, they're in a war. And they're saying the Armenians are collaborating with the Russians who are invading us from the east. The Germans, of course, see themselves in a war. They're fighting a war against the Jews. They keep saying the Jews are the partisans. Not only in 1918, when they, so to speak, stabbed us in the back, but in 1941, the partisans and the Jews, Hitler says to Himmler, treat them like partisans. And partisans, of course, have to be executed because they are not regular forces. And so there's always a semblance of war, and the people carrying out the killing are usually wearing uniforms, usually under army control or police control, and usually perceive themselves not as murderers, but as soldiers. the soldiers fighting to protect their own people. So in that sense, modern genocide is very much built around this notion, first of victimization, and secondly of a general kind of military confrontation. And the people being killed, even though they may be babies, old people, pregnant women, are somehow perceived as connected to the enemy who will destroy us if we don't destroy them.
Makes me think, actually, I was in Serbia last week interviewing Russian dissidents who often go to Serbia for these reasons. And interesting because, of course, Serbs were victims of genocide in World War II at the hands of the Croatian Ustashi, who was so vicious the Nazis often thought they were out of control. And of course, you know, the Serb civilians, thousands were killed in the Balkan Wars of the 90s. And this Russian dissident told me that on a recent ruling over Srebrenica, which was just to be genocide, on one of the tallest towers in Belgrade, the capital, they put a big neon sign rotating saying, "We are not a genocidal people." I just thought there's some, I mean, I thought there was always some parallels. It's quite interesting, actually, that Ariel Sharon, the former Prime Minister of Israel, was himself quite sympathetic to Bosnian Serb nationalism. But it's that sense of victim, we are victims. And there was the basis, it's not untrue, but that was then used to justify heinous atrocities. But still, there was a self-perception of victimhood.
Well, you know, I mean, one sort of funny item is that both two major Israeli chiefs of staff, Bar-Lev and Elazar, who was the chief of staff in 1973, came from Montenegro and had a sort of own family history with that region. During the war in the 1990s in the former Yugoslavia, Israeli sentiments were very much on the side of the Serbs. And that was because people remembered Tito and the partisans fighting against the Nazis. And this was one of the major sort of insurgencies against the Nazis. People didn't know very well that during the Nazi occupation of Serbia, the Germans killed, first of all the Jewish Serb men very quickly because they used them as hostages. There were partisan actions against the German army. The Germans started taking hostages and killing them. That only increased the resistance against the Wehrmacht. And so the Germans, but by now they had quotas that they had to kill 100 Serb men for every German soldier killed, but it was not very effective. So they said, well, maybe we can square the circle and kill Jewish men. Because then the Serbs won't really care, and we will fill the quota. And so they killed 7,000 Jewish males, and then they enclosed the women and children in camps. And they thought, what are we going to do with them? They're now in these camps just north of Belgrade, and they brought a gas van and drove those people, thousands of them, through Belgrade in gas vans as they were dying, to be then buried, because they were dead by the time they got to the other side of the city, to be buried on the other side of Belgrade. And the population, of course, could hear everything that was going on. So this kind of memory that existed in Israel, that yes, the Serbs were fighting on our side because they were fighting, the Germans were the Croats were not only killing Serbs, they were collaborating with the Nazis and killing Jews, was itself kind of rosy. But it's interesting that in Israel, there was very strong support for Serbia, probably the only country associated with the West that was supportive of Serbia because of these memories. And you know, the interesting thing about that war is that all those names of the Ustasha and the organizations of World War II resurfaced during the war in the former Yugoslavia. So these long memories of victimization, one of the other, came out. There's actually a movie about that called Underground by Kusturica that is precisely about how these memories of World War II resurface and become the sort of leitmotif of the war in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s.
That's really, really fascinating, by the way. Really fascinating context. I was just interested because of your trip to Israel about the kind of general mentality, and you went there to do a talk, and you were kind of barracked by protesters who targeted a talk you were doing very angrily. And I'm interested in this because in states which are committing atrocities in which there is widespread consent and acquiescence, you know, which is something that needs to be understood because, you know, in any society, the number of people who are sociopaths is tiny. It's 2%. So what we're talking about are people who are loving, who love, who, you know, who grieve, who have their hearts broken, who have fears, anxieties, who would see someone suffering in the street and want to help them. And how, because of dehumanization, that makes them acquiesce or actively supportive of atrocities. And you watch Israeli television, people debating killing children on the basis that they'll end up being you know, just kind of, you look at it and think, what has happened? But I'm just interested in what your thoughts about how that mentality, how it can become so widespread. Because I interview, and I use this channel intentionally to interview extremely courageous Israeli citizens who are standing up, and they are so courageous because they're so isolated. You look at the polling, it's bleak. 60% oppose all humanitarian aid, which just means everyone dying. And Jewish Israelis are divided between thinking not enough firepower has been used or just enough has been used, with 2% saying too much has been used. And you look at that and think, how is this possible? So I'm just interested in what you think about that, because sometimes there's a sense of, well, they're not seeing what's really happening. But I don't know. I just think everyone's got the internet. You know, it's not like this is all on, a lot of stuff, the terrible stuff's not on, it's not like you watch it on British television, you see it on the internet. What's your thoughts? What's happening, and what can we learn from that?
Well, you know, the first thing I would say, just statistically, is that up to now, in 10 months, the IDF has killed at least 2% of the population of Gaza. We don't know exactly how it breaks down to fighters and non-fighters, but the majority are civilians, and the majority of the civilians are children. 2% of the population in 10 months is enormous. So we have to take that into account. There's only one other case in which 2% of the population were killed, and that's in Syria. But it took, in the 21st century, but it took 13 years. And here it's been done in 10 months. How does the Israeli public, why does it behave in this way? Look, there was an interesting, of course, one more horrifying case, that apparently an errant Hezbollah missile hit a Druze village and killed 12 children who were in a playground. And in Israel, although these are Druze, and they're Syrian Druze, I don't know how many of them were Israeli citizens, because there's a kind of conflict there whether to become Israeli citizens or not. The public was completely appalled, the killing of 12 children, and there was a lot of talk about that, and that Israel must strike back. And of course, the Druze community was very angry and asked for revenge against that. And when you mention the dying the same day, in fact, more than that, larger numbers of children were being killed that very day in Gaza, and nobody even talked about it. So what I'm saying is that these kind of situations create, actually, at least for a while, a sense of solidarity in your own group. And people feel very sentimental. They feel that they care for each other. They volunteer to help each other. They feel morally elevated because they are now helping each other in a situation of war, of violence, of threat, of insecurity. And that sense of solidarity can translate also into total blocking off of the other side, of not thinking about it at all. Yes, Israelis can, of course, watch exactly what's going on in Gaza. Most of them don't. It's not broadcast on Israeli TV, as you know, of course. You see Gaza only through the gun sights of Israeli soldiers. But it's easy to get that information. Most people don't want to get it. And when you raise it with them, as I was writing, and literally people's eyes glaze over. They just want to change the subject. And that's if they don't really get angry at you. That's among liberals whose eyes glaze over. If it's people from the right, they will get very angry at you and say, all those people are involved. They all cheered when our women were raped and so forth. Now, is that rare? It's not rare. I mean, we've seen it in many other places. There wasn't that much, there was a little bit, but not much resistance to the bombing of open German cities by the RAF in World War II. Most people, they cared about the Blitz. But when the RAF was burning people alive in German cities, people thought it was fine. So in war, you have that. But in Israel, there's a much longer process of dehumanizing Palestinians. And that's something that I think now has sort of surfaced much more clearly. So people never really cared much about what was happening to Palestinians. People lived for decades right next to the fence of Gaza and right next to the wall, the so-called security barrier of the West Bank, and their own children, husbands, grandchildren were patrolling those places, were breaking into people's homes. And they were completely indifferent to it. They thought this can be managed. What Israelis saw as being managed for the people upon whom this kind of policy was being implemented, it was dehumanizing, brutalizing, and this was not seen at all in Israel. And when you raise the question of the occupation in Israel, even during the protests against the judicial coup, in the months leading to October 7th, right, between February and October 2023, if you raise the question of occupation, most people among the protesters said that's not the issue. We don't have time for that now. We have to protect our own rights that the government is trying to take away from us. And so after October 7th, with the horror of what happened that day, and it was pretty horrific, there have been exaggerations which are totally unnecessary, and I don't know why they had to be recycled. But the event itself was a massacre of hundreds and hundreds of civilians. With that, coming on top of a general dehumanization of Palestinians, I think explains why people in Israel are so totally indifferent to what is being done in their name and often by their own children in Gaza.
I mean, just on that, just kind of a couple of final things kind of linked together, really. I mean, firstly, just the role of Western states, because there is something quite unique about this, isn't there? In that to have what is a crime of this scale, and you mentioned, even if we go by the, I mean, I would regard the official death toll as, for the reasons often explained, 40,000 is a drastic underestimate. They exclude those buried under rubble, thousands. Right. They exclude indirect deaths. I mean, if every single hospital in Britain and the United States was suddenly destroyed without a war, that would mean a massive death sentence, a huge death sentence imposed on vast numbers of people. It's a war, and the hospital system's been destroyed. Cancer patients, people with health conditions, diabetes. We could go through the list. Just the general stress imposed, people who are elderly, infirm. I mean, it's just endless. Hunger, illness, spreading, polio at the moment, as well as the reporting system's broken down. So even then, with 40,000, as you know, I mean, you mentioned Syria, that's 2% over 13 years. Iraq, 1% over 20 years. Yugoslavia, 1% over 10 years. I mean, it's a hideous total. I mean, it just seems, I mean, the Whiggish view of history was always, it was buried on the Somme and in Auschwitz-Birkenau, with the idea of history just becomes more enlightened and progressive and all the rest of it. But isn't it just, what's your thoughts about this, that it's 2024 and we have Western states, including a government, the Democrats in the United States, and they have armed and supported and the difference with previous occasions is this is live streamed. I mean, Palestinian journalists, the biggest slaughter of journalistic history, so it's huge cost. They posted these atrocities all the time on a daily basis. It's one of the most evidenced crimes in history. What does this tell us? I don't know. I'm just trying to, that was a long way. I mean, I'm not trying to work, I'm trying to work out what I mean by this, but you know what I mean? I mean, it's just the scale of the crime and the scale of Western complicity. There's something that is quite unique, isn't it, given where we're at?
Look, I mean, first of all, it's obviously, as you say, it's extremely depressing to think that we're now, you know, a quarter of the way into the 21st century. The century began, it was supposed to be the end of history, you know, it was supposed to be a much better time. And the case in Gaza, I can think of various other situations that we're in now where people seem to have entirely forgotten the lessons of the 20th century, just the rise of populism, of extremism, of racism. But this is a particularly horrific case. As you say, it's being broadcast live. It's being broadcast live, and yet at the same time, it's not. That is, that there are very few people on the ground from other organizations. So it's being broadcast live largely by Al Jazeera, which is taking also an extremely heavy toll in lives. So we can sort of get into a very depressing conversation about where humanity is going and how international law has been shown to be useless, and the international order is just allowing this to happen. And I think in part you can say that, but I prefer to think about it differently, maybe because I don't just want to get into this doomsday kind of mood. My sense is that things could have worked out differently, and that even now, despite the terrible price that is being paid, things can be not simply turned around, but actually can lead to some kind of resolution of an extremely long-term crisis. So let me say first, I think that if President Biden in November or December 2023 had actually acted differently after hugging Netanyahu and all that, had said to Netanyahu, listen, you have to stop fire now. And if you don't, you're on your own. You can do whatever you like, but you're not going to get political coverage, diplomatic coverage, and you're not going to get the stream of shells and bombs and all of that. Then we would not have been where we are, which is that the United States now is trying desperately to prevent a regional war. Nobody knows where that war might go. I mean, what we are seeing now can be just peanuts compared to what will happen. And nobody wants it. It's not that Iran actually wants it. It's not that Hezbollah actually wants it. It's not that the IDF wants it. But the trajectory on the ground and a number of bad actors, the worst of whom right now is Netanyahu, seem to want it and may lead to it. But there was a way to prevent it. It was not taken. So it isn't just a kind of, you know, determinism. It had to do with particular decisions and wrong decision being made at that time. But I would say that even now, it is possible to change this trajectory entirely. Now, it won't bring people back to life, and the destruction that we spoke about in Gaza is a generations-long event now. And the effect that this will have on the population, on the children, is unimaginable. But in terms of politics, there is another way. And one has to say that what we saw now is the limits of power, that nobody can win this conflict. Israel cannot win this conflict. The Palestinians cannot win this conflict. Iran cannot win this. Nobody can win. And if you finally reach the conclusion that you cannot win militarily, you have to find a political way out of it. one should have thought about it from the beginning, that wars have to be led by politics, not the other way around. But now I think that many Israelis realize that the limits of their own power. The more Israel is fighting this war, the weaker it is getting by the day. It's getting weaker politically, and it's getting weaker militarily. And so there may be some hope. It's possible that it will go the other way around. It's possible that Israel will become an apartheid pariah state, living on its sword, increasingly isolated, and it could last like that for several decades before it implodes. But one has to hope that it will be helped from within and from without to reach a different goal that many people in the region would like to see. The fact that it hasn't happened is in part also a failure, obviously, of Israeli leadership, also Palestinian leadership, but also of international leadership. And one would hope that international leaders, whatever else we have to say about them, for their own national interests, will act differently and enforce a different kind of resolution to this ongoing catastrophe.
Well, maybe a slightly hopeful or not as depressing place to end as it could have been, given everything. Again, always an honor, a masterclass as ever. Your clarity, your moral clarity, your academic clarity shine through as ever. Do share this video, everyone. Make sure he's heard as loudly as possible. I think as many people need to hear as possible. Leave your comments. Love to hear your thoughts. Do subscribe. But Professor Bartov, thank you so much for joining us as ever.
Thank you very much.